I had a good life, or at least, I thought I did. I'm Kevin Andrews, 67 years old, and for 40 years, I was married to Stella. Looking back now, I never imagined I'd be sitting here, alone in this quiet house, wondering how everything fell apart. It wasn't supposed to end this way, not after 4 decades together. But I guess no one ever sees these things coming. I first met Stella back in the summer of 1978. It was a different world then, simpler. There were no cell phones buzzing constantly, no social media reminding you of what everyone else was doing. Back then, people met in person, face to face, usually through friends or at local events. That's exactly how it happened with us. We met at a community dance, the kind that small towns used to put on every month, back when people still valued spending time together. I wasn't looking for anything serious. I was 25, just starting out in my career as an insurance broker, and I wasn't in any rush. But there she was, Stella, 22 years old, fresh out of college, with this energy about her that drew me in from the moment I laid eyes on her. I remember that night like it was yesterday. The dance hall was packed with couples, most of them a little older than us, but we didn't care. The band was playing old rock tunes, and I wasn't much of a dancer, but I gave it a shot. Stella? She moved like she was born on a dance floor. There was something about the way she smiled at me that made me feel like the luckiest guy in the world. We spent that night talking more than we danced, sitting on the sidelines, getting to know each other. She told me about her dreams of becoming a teacher, how she loved reading classic novels, and how she wanted to make a difference in the world. I was smitten. We spent the whole summer together, inseparable. Back in those days, dates were simpler too. We didn't need fancy restaurants or expensive outings. I'd pick her up in my old Chevy, and we'd head out to the drive-in theater just outside of town. I can still hear the crackle of the speaker as we watched movies under the stars. It wasn't the films that mattered, though. It was the time we spent, the late-night talks, and the way she'd rest her head on my shoulder when the night got cool. I can't help but think about those drives we used to take. Gas was cheap back then, so we'd spend weekends just driving with no particular destination in mind. We'd roll down the windows, let the breeze in, and listen to the radio. Led Zeppelin, Fleetwood Mac, Boston, those songs still take me back. I can almost feel the warm summer air, see the sun setting on the horizon, and hear Stella singing along to every tune. Life felt so free then, like we had all the time in the world. By 1982, things had gotten serious between us. I'd saved up enough to buy a house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small 2-story place on the outskirts of Denver, but it was ours. I still remember the day we moved in. We didn't have much furniture, just a couple of hand-me-downs from my folks and some cheap stuff we picked up at a local store. But it didn't matter. We spent that first weekend painting the walls ourselves. Stella was determined to make the place feel like home, so she picked out all the colors. I wasn't much for decorating, but I went along with it. We laughed as we splattered paint on each other, making a mess of things. I'd give anything to go back to those days. It wasn't long after that our boys, Carl and David, came along. They were born 2 years apart, first Carl in '83, then David in '85. Suddenly, our world revolved around them. Parenthood has a way of doing that. It's funny how fast those early years go by. 1 minute, you're changing diapers and wondering when you'll ever get a full night's sleep again. The next, you're sitting in the stands at Little League games, cheering them on, and before you know it, they're packing up for college. Those were some of the best years of my life. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. I kept working as an insurance broker, and Stella got her teaching degree. She started teaching elementary school, and let me tell you, she was a natural. The kids loved her. Every so often, I'd run into one of her former students at the grocery store, now all grown up, and they always say the same thing, how much they loved being in Mrs. Andrews' class. I was proud of her, though I probably didn't tell her that enough. We had our struggles, of course. Every marriage does. There were tight months where the bills piled up, and we had to make do with what we had. But we always managed to pull through. We'd sit on the porch after the kids were in bed, sipping cheap wine, talking about the future. Retirement felt so far off back then, but we dreamed about it. We talked about traveling, seeing the places we always wanted to visit but never had the time or money for. Paris, Italy, maybe even a cross-country road trip in an RV. As the years went on, we settled into a routine. The boys grew up, went off to college, and started their own lives. Stella and I found ourselves with more time on our hands. We thought we'd use it to reconnect, to finally do all the things we'd put off for so long. But something changed. Looking back now, I'm not sure exactly when it started. Maybe it was when we both retired, and suddenly, we were around each other all the time. It was subtle at first. Stella got involved in her own activities, yoga classes, book clubs, things like that. I didn't mind. In fact, I encouraged it. I figured it was good for her to have her own space, her own interests. But then, she started coming home later. She'd say she was meeting friends for lunch, or that her book club ran late, but something felt off. She was different, more distant. I'd ask her how her day was, and she'd give me these short, vague answers. I told myself it was just a phase, that maybe she was adjusting to retirement, like I was. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The first real clue came during a Sunday dinner with our boys. Carl, our eldest, mentioned seeing Stella at a restaurant downtown a few days earlier. But I didn't remember her saying anything about going out that day. Must have been one of her book club get-togethers, I joked, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling in my gut. But Carl's face told a different story. He hesitated, glanced at his brother David, and then quickly changed the subject. I didn't push it. Maybe I didn't want to know the truth. After all, we'd been married for 40 years. But that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. I started noticing more things, small, seemingly insignificant things that began to add up. She'd take phone calls in the other room, or she'd get up in the middle of the night, saying she couldn't sleep, and I'd find her sitting on the couch, staring off into space. I tried to talk to her about it, but every time I brought it up, she'd brush me off. "You're imagining things, Kevin," she'd say with that dismissive tone that only made me feel more foolish. I didn't want to believe it, but the signs were there. I just couldn't bring myself to face them. So, one day, I did something I never thought I'd do. I followed her. I'm not proud of it, but I had to know. That day, she told me she was going to her usual yoga class. I waited about 10 minutes after she left, then got into my car and followed her. My heart was pounding the whole time. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that I was being paranoid. But when she didn't go to the yoga studio and instead drove across town to a hotel, my worst fears were confirmed. I sat in that parking lot for what felt like hours, staring at the entrance, waiting for her to come out. And when she did, she wasn't alone. She was with him, a man I'd never seen before. They walked out together, holding hands like a couple of teenagers sneaking around. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I wanted to get out of the car, to storm over there and demand answers. But I couldn't move. I just sat there, frozen in place, watching as my wife of 40 years walked away with another man. That night, she came home like nothing had happened, kissed me on the cheek, and asked how my day was. I couldn't even look at her. After that day, things were never the same. I didn't confront her right away, couldn't bring myself to do it. The sight of her holding hands with that man haunted me. 40 years of marriage, and now it was all unraveling in front of my eyes. I kept waiting for the right moment to confront her, but when I'd look at her across the dinner table or see her smile as she went about her day, the words just wouldn't come. It felt like a different life. The truth is, I was afraid of what I might lose. The life we built, the memories we shared, it all seemed to hang in the balance. How do you throw away 4 decades? And for what? Some fleeting affair? But something inside me snapped, and I decided I wasn't going to go down quietly. I wasn't going to be the fool in this story. That's when I started planning. You see, Stella had been volunteering with a major charity for the last few years. It was one of those things she got involved with after retirement. Helping raise money for children's education, or at least that's what she said it was about. She'd always been big on appearances, making sure people saw her as the generous, loving wife and mother. The perfect picture of a retiree doing good in the world. But I knew her better than that. Stella loved the attention. The more high-profile the events were, the more she threw herself into them. It wasn't about the cause, it was about being seen. Fancy dinners, meeting influential people, she soaked it all in. And for a while, I didn't mind. I figured it gave her something to do, kept her busy. But now, I saw it for what it really was, a way to inflate her ego, to distract herself from the life we had. I started digging around, paying closer attention to the charity's finances. She never really talked to me about the money, but I knew she had her hands deep in the fundraising efforts. She'd even been named to some kind of committee. Turns out, Stella wasn't as careful as she thought she was. The deeper I dug, the more I uncovered. She had been overseeing some donations, large ones, and redirecting funds into side projects she claimed were for the charity, but that's not what I found. Some of the money was being funneled into private accounts, which looked like they were funding trips and events that had nothing to do with the kids the charity was supposed to help. All under her signature. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. A few emails, some records I managed to get access to from her personal files, and I had enough to blow the whole thing wide open. But I wasn't done. I needed to set it up so she wouldn't see it coming. She needed to be fully implicated without realizing she was walking into a trap. One day, while she was out, probably with him, I made sure to install some software on her computer. Nothing too obvious, but enough to keep track of her communications, particularly her emails with the charity. She thought she was clever, but she wasn't nearly careful enough. She trusted her home office, her emails, her spreadsheets. Everything was right there, waiting for me. I laid low for a few weeks after that, playing the part of the oblivious husband. I'd make small talk, ask about the charity in a casual way, and watch her talk about it like she was doing God's work. All the while, she was helping herself to the charity's money, setting up the perfect scandal without even knowing it. One day, I casually asked her about the next big event. She was excited, said they were planning a huge gala at one of the fanciest hotels in Denver. Big donors, influential people, the whole deal. It was the kind of thing she loved, glamour, attention, the spotlight. I nodded along, listening to her talk about the details. She had no idea I was pulling the strings behind the scenes. I contacted one of the donors, an older man I'd met once at one of her events. Let's call him Mr. Haynes, a real estate developer with a lot of money and even more connections. I planted the seed, told him I'd come across some concerning information about where his donations were actually going. He was curious, to say the least, and I made sure to feed him just enough details to keep him on edge without giving everything away. He was the kind of guy who didn't take kindly to being swindled. Once he was hooked, I knew it was only a matter of time before he started asking the right questions. The day of the gala arrived, and Stella was in her element. She looked stunning, of course, dressed in a designer gown she'd bought for the occasion, her hair done perfectly, every detail meticulously planned. I played my role well, dressed up in a tux, smiling at all the right people, standing by her side like the doting husband. No one had any idea what was coming. The event was beautiful, a real show. Stella gave her speech, thanked all the donors, talked about the kids they were helping, about the future and how important it was to support education. People clapped, raised their glasses, wrote checks. It was perfect, like something out of one of those charity gala brochures. But behind the scenes, everything was falling apart. Mr. Haynes had done his homework, thanks to the information I'd fed him. He wasn't going to let this slide. By the end of the night, whispers started circulating. Someone was asking questions about the finances, about discrepancies in the donations. Stella didn't notice at first, she was too busy mingling, basking in the glory of her successful night. But the next morning, it all came crashing down. The emails came flooding in. Questions from donors, from the charity's board, from the press. It didn't take long for the story to leak. Major charity scandal, funds mismanaged by prominent committee member. It was all over the news, and her name was right at the center of it. Stella was blindsided. I watched her unravel as the accusations piled up. She kept trying to explain, trying to deny, but the evidence was too strong. The charity was in damage control mode, distancing themselves from her as fast as they could. Her reputation was shattered. She went from being the shining face of the charity to the person everyone blamed for the scandal. I'd like to say I felt bad about it, but I didn't. Not after what she did to me. Not after seeing her walk out of that hotel with that man. This wasn't about revenge, though. This was about taking back control, making sure she couldn't just walk away from what she did without consequences. As the fallout continued, I couldn't help but think back to the early days. Back when everything seemed simpler. When a life together was all that mattered. It felt like a different time, a different world. Stella had become someone I didn't recognize. And maybe I'd changed too. But the thing is, life has a way of catching up with you, no matter how hard you try to outrun it. She tried to hold on for a while after that, tried to rebuild her image, salvage what was left of her reputation. But the damage was done. No one would trust her again. Not in that world. And as for us? Well, we barely spoke after that. After the scandal broke, things got worse for Stella quickly. It wasn't just the media frenzy, or the donors pulling out from the charity, it was the legal trouble that started to creep in. The charity, desperate to save face, distanced themselves from her immediately and hinted at the possibility of fraud. It didn't take long before they started making noises about legal action. Accusations flew about mismanaged funds, improper allocations, and fraudulent donations. It wasn't long before the authorities got involved. Stella found herself facing the very real possibility of criminal charges. I could see the fear in her eyes, though she tried to hide it. She had been blindsided by the fallout, convinced she could smooth it over with a few well-timed apologies and public statements. But this was bigger than her usual charm offensive could handle. She needed help, and that's when Emily entered the picture. Emily had been one of Stella's closest friends for years. They'd met back in the early 90s when Carl and David were still in school. Emily's kids went to the same elementary as ours, and they hit it off right away. Over the years, Emily had been more than just a friend, she'd been a confidant. Whenever Stella had an issue, whether it was about the boys, our marriage, or later on, her charity work, Emily was the one she'd turn to. But Emily was more than just a friend. She was a damn good lawyer, one of the best. She worked with a big firm downtown, and when Stella realized she was in real legal trouble, Emily was the first person she called. I could tell that Emily had Stella's back. They were thick as thieves, and Emily was determined to clear her name. Emily wasted no time. She brought in a lawyer from her firm, William Hayes, a big shot who specialized in corporate fraud and financial crimes. William was sharp, calm under pressure, and didn't take nonsense from anyone. Stella trusted him immediately, which wasn't surprising. She trusted anyone who seemed powerful enough to fix things for her. The moment William got involved, things started turning around for her. He worked fast, filing motions, talking to the charity's legal team, and poking holes in their accusations. He challenged the evidence they had against Stella, claiming it was circumstantial at best. I could see things starting to shift. The press quieted down a little, and the charity started to hesitate in their pursuit of legal action. It wasn't long before I realized that William was going to succeed if I didn't do something. I watched from the sidelines as Stella's legal team started picking apart the case. I kept my distance, acting like the supportive husband, but in reality, I knew that if William kept going, he'd eventually uncover the truth. And the truth wasn't going to implicate Stella alone, it would come back to me. After all, I'd orchestrated this whole thing. I was the one who had set her up, who had made sure the evidence pointed straight at her. If William dug deep enough, he'd find the breadcrumbs I'd left behind, and my role in the whole mess would come to light. So, I decided to act. One evening, I reached out to William directly. I didn't go through the official channels, no emails, no phone calls to his office. I went down to the courthouse, found out where he liked to grab drinks after work, and waited. He was sitting at a corner table when I walked in, his briefcase at his side, looking like a man who had the weight of the world on his shoulders. I approached him quietly, not wanting to make a scene. "Mind if I sit?" I asked, standing beside his table. He looked up at me, surprised but not alarmed. He motioned to the chair across from him, and I sat down. "Mr. Andrews," he said, his voice calm but curious. "What can I do for you?" I leaned in slightly, keeping my voice low. "I wanted to talk to you, man to man," I began. "Not about the case, not officially. Just a conversation." He raised an eyebrow, but he didn't interrupt. I could tell he wasn't sure where I was going with this. "You're doing a hell of a job, William," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. "You're digging into this mess, and from what I can see, you're going to pull Stella out of it." "That's my job," he replied, his expression still guarded. I nodded. "I get that. But there's something you don't know about this situation. Something that I need to tell you." William leaned back in his chair, studying me. "I'm listening." I took a deep breath. "Stella's been cheating on me." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and painful. For a moment, William said nothing, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. He wasn't expecting this. I continued before he could respond. "I've known for a while now. I followed her, saw her with the guy. That's what started all of this. The scandal, the setup, everything. I couldn't let her walk away after what she did to me, so I made sure she got tangled up in this mess. William's expression didn't change, but I could see the shift in his posture, the way his fingers tightened slightly around the edge of his glass. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was a man, and I could tell he understood exactly what I was saying. I'm not proud of it, I said quietly. But after 40 years of marriage, after everything we've been through, I couldn't just let her betray me like that. She's been unfaithful, and now I'm asking you, man to man, to back off. This isn't about her reputation anymore. This is about the fact that she destroyed our life together, and I can't let her get away with it. William stayed silent for a long moment, his eyes locked on mine. I could see him weighing everything, considering his options. He wasn't the kind of man who backed down easily, but I could tell my words had struck a chord. I'm not asking you to do anything illegal, I added. I'm just asking you to understand where I'm coming from. I know you're good at what you do, but sometimes, it's not about winning. It's about understanding what's right. Finally, William nodded slowly. He didn't say much after that, just gathered his things, paid for his drink, and stood to leave. I'll think about what you've said, he told me before he walked out. But I can't promise anything. I watched him go, unsure if I'd gotten through to him. But the next day, I found out just how much of an impact I'd made. William withdrew from the case. He cited a conflict of interest, leaving Stella's legal team scrambling to find a replacement. It wasn't long after that when Emily stepped back too, claiming she couldn't work on the case with William gone. Stella was devastated. She didn't understand what had happened. One minute, she was on the verge of clearing her name, and the next, her strongest ally was gone. I didn't say anything, didn't offer any explanations. I just sat back and watched as the pieces fell apart around her. The legal problems didn't go away, but without William, the case dragged on without much progress. Stella's reputation was in tatters, her charity work gone, and the prospect of criminal charges still loomed over her head. Without William, her once ironclad defense began to crumble. Her friend Emily did everything she could to help, but without William's connections and expertise, she was fighting a losing battle. The charity continued to press forward with its accusations, and the media, smelling blood, only added fuel to the fire. Reports of mismanaged funds, fraudulent donations, and mishandled charity events dominated the news. Her name was synonymous with scandal, and no amount of apologies or explanations could change that. I watched it all unfold with a strange sense of satisfaction. Not because I enjoyed seeing her suffer, but because justice, in my eyes, was finally being served. Stella had betrayed me, destroyed the life we'd built, and now, the world was seeing her for who she really was. It wasn't just about the money or the scandal, it was about her lies, her betrayal, and her arrogance. And the best part? She still didn't know I was behind it all. But our sons, Carl and David, were a different story. Carl, our eldest, was supportive of his mother throughout the entire ordeal. He'd always been closer to Stella, and when the scandal broke, he stood by her side. He refused to believe she could be guilty of anything and dismissed the accusations as a misunderstanding, a mistake that could be cleared up with enough time. Carl was convinced the system was rigged against her, and he wasn't shy about expressing his frustrations. He visited often, trying to help her pick up the pieces, reassuring her that it would all work out in the end. David, on the other hand, was more careful. He was always the quieter of the two, more observant. He didn't jump to conclusions the way Carl did. Instead, he watched, he listened, and he asked questions. And as the case against Stella grew stronger, David's suspicions started to shift. I could feel it in the way he looked at me, in the way he avoided asking direct questions but let his eyes linger a little too long. One evening, David came over after Carl had left. Stella was out, probably at some meeting with Emily or her legal team, so it was just the two of us. We sat in the living room, the same one where we'd shared so many family moments, but now it felt colder, emptier. David was quiet at first, sipping his coffee, staring at the wall. I knew something was coming, but I waited for him to make the first move. "Dad," he said after a long silence, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened." I didn't respond right away, just nodded, letting him gather his thoughts. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he continued, his voice low. "Mom says she's innocent, but there's just so much evidence against her. It doesn't add up." I could feel the tension in the room, the weight of his words pressing down on both of us. "I know," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. It's a mess. David set his cup down, his eyes narrowing slightly as he leaned forward. You don't seem surprised by any of this, Dad. In fact, you've been pretty calm about the whole thing. Almost too calm. I shrugged. I've had a lot of time to process it. I guess I've come to terms with the fact that things aren't always what they seem. He didn't seem satisfied with my answer. Carl thinks you're just being strong for Mom, but I don't think that's it. I've been watching you, Dad, and I get the feeling you're not as uninvolved as you're letting on. There it was. The moment I'd been waiting for. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, but even I could hear the strain in my voice. David didn't back down. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. I've been going over everything in my head, and there's no way this all just happened by chance. You're too smart for that. The way Mom's reputation fell apart so quickly, the way the case against her built up almost overnight, it doesn't make sense unless someone was pulling the strings. I stayed silent, feeling the room close in around me. David's voice softened, but his gaze remained sharp. Was it you, Dad? Did you have something to do with this? For a moment, I considered lying. I could have denied it, could have played the role of the loyal husband who was just as blindsided as everyone else. But as I looked at my son, at the worry in his eyes, I knew I couldn't keep it from him any longer. Yes, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. David didn't react right away. He just sat there, staring at me, waiting for me to continue. I did it, I confessed. I set her up. The scandal, the charity, all of it. I made sure she got caught up in the mess. He blinked, processing my words, and I could see the gears turning in his head. The answer to a hypothetical question was simple, but saying it out loud felt like ripping open a wound that had barely healed. She cheated on me, David. I caught her with another man. After 40 years of marriage, she betrayed me. I couldn't just let her walk away from that, not after everything we've been through. I needed her to feel the pain she caused me. David's face changed the moment I mentioned her betrayal. The anger, the suspicion, the frustration, it all seemed to drain away, replaced by something else. Understanding, maybe. Sympathy. He leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on his knees, and sighed. Mom cheated on you, he asked quietly. I nodded. I followed her. I saw her with him. I couldn't let it go, David. I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. For a long time, we sat there in silence, the weight of my confession hanging between us. David's expression had softened, and the fire in his eyes had dimmed. He wasn't angry anymore, at least not in the way he had been when he first sat down. Finally, he stood up, grabbing his coat from the back of the chair. Okay, he said simply. I looked up at him, surprised by the calmness in his voice. Okay? He nodded, his face unreadable. Okay, Dad. I get it. Without another word, David walked out of the house. I sat there, listening to the silence. He understood. I wasn't sure how, or why, but he understood. Well, I hope so. That day started like any other. I'd gone out to meet some old friends, planning to stay late, but something inside me told me to go home earlier than I'd told Stella. I wasn't even sure why, maybe it was just one of those instincts you can't shake. I parked the car a little down the street and walked up to the house, taking my time. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows across the yard. It was quiet, too quiet. As I rounded the corner toward the front yard, I saw them. Stella was standing outside, right near the side of the house, and she wasn't alone. He was there, the same man I had seen months ago, the one who shattered my trust. The one she betrayed me with. And she was crying, her face buried in his chest as he held her in his arms. My blood boiled. I could barely think straight, my body moving before my mind could catch up. My hands clenched into fists as I stormed toward them, my footsteps heavy against the gravel. They didn't see me at first, too wrapped up in their moment. Get the hell away from her. I shouted, my voice trembling with rage. They both turned, startled, as I closed the distance between us. The man immediately took a step back, his hands up like he was surrendering, but that didn't stop me from getting in his face. I told you once, I spat, standing inches from him. I should have beaten you to a pulp the first time I saw you with her. You're lucky I didn't. But this is the last time. Get out, and if I ever see you again, you won't walk away so easily. The man didn't say a word, just gave me this guilty look as if he knew he didn't belong there. Then he turned and walked down the driveway, disappearing into the shadows as the evening grew darker. Stella stood there, wiping away tears, not saying anything. I was still shaking with anger. It wasn't until she finally spoke that I realized the real confrontation was just beginning. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp. "You saw us before?" My heart sank. I hadn't meant to say it. In the heat of the moment, I'd let it slip. I'd never told her about the first time I saw them together, outside that hotel. I could feel the ground shifting beneath me, and suddenly, I knew I was in trouble. I stammered, trying to backtrack. "It's not what you think, Stella. I saw you, yes, but..." Her face twisted in realization, the pieces falling into place in her mind. "You saw us at the workshop, didn't you? That's how you knew, that's how you set me up." She took a step back, her eyes wide with shock, then horror. In a flash, she turned and bolted toward the house. I knew exactly what she was going to do. She was going to call Emily, or maybe someone else, to tell them everything. She'd piece it together, she'd fight back. And I couldn't let that happen. Not now. I chased after her, grabbing her arm just as she reached for the door. "Stella, wait!" I shouted, my grip tightening around her wrist. "Don't do this." She struggled, trying to pull away, her face a mixture of fury and fear. "You set me up," she screamed. "You ruined my life. You destroyed everything, and you did it because of some stupid affair?" I pushed her back gently but firmly, keeping her from reaching the phone. "Yes," I admitted, my voice cold. "Yes, I did. But don't act like you didn't bring this on yourself. I gave you 40 years, Stella. 40 years, and this is how you repay me?" She was trembling, her breath coming in sharp gasps. For a moment, I thought she was going to break down completely, but then something shifted in her eyes. She stopped struggling and stood still, staring at me. "What did you expect?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the tears. "Why would you treat me like this? Why?" I didn't have the energy to fight anymore. The anger, the betrayal, it had all worn me down. I let go of her arm and stepped back, shaking my head. "I thought it was fair, Stella. After what you did, I thought this was the least you deserved." She looked at me, waiting for more, but I was done talking. She glanced at the phone again, and I could see the wheels turning in her head. She wanted to call someone, anyone, Emily, the police, a lawyer, it didn't matter. But I didn't care anymore. "Go ahead," I said, my voice steady. "Call whoever you want. There's nothing you can prove. William's gone. Emily? She can't handle this on her own. You think you can hire some high-priced lawyer or a detective? Go ahead, try. But you won't find anything. It's all buried too deep. You're not getting out of this, Stella." For a moment, she stood there, staring at me, her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in years. Not love, not hate, but a kind of resignation. She knew I was right. Without William, there was no one who could dig her out of the hole she was in. No lawyer, no detective, no friend could help her now. She was trapped, just like I'd planned. She sighed heavily, her shoulders slumping, and turned away from the phone. "I don't even know you anymore," she muttered, more to herself than to me. "And I don't know you either," I replied, my voice flat. "Not after what you did." She walked past me, heading up the stairs without another word. The day finally came. The courtroom was full, the air thick with anticipation and judgment. Stella sat at the defendant's table, looking more fragile than I'd ever seen her. Her once bright, confident demeanor was gone, replaced by a woman beaten down by the weight of what she was about to face. I sat in the gallery with Carl and David on either side of me. Carl's face was tense, his sadness evident as he watched his mother. He still couldn't believe she was going to prison. David, though, had that same neutral expression he'd worn since he learned the truth. I thought I would feel something, relief, triumph, maybe even a sense of closure. After all, this was what I had wanted, wasn't it? Stella was finally paying the price, not just for the fraud, but for what she had done to me. For the betrayal. For throwing away our life together. But as the judge handed down the sentence, I sat there, staring straight ahead, and realized I felt nothing. Nothing at all. It was like watching a stranger's life fall apart, not my own. I had one, hadn't I? She was sentenced to prison, though not as long as I might have hoped. They gave her a plea deal, several years, but she could get out early for good behavior. A few more years, and she'd be free. But what did it matter? Whether she served 1 year or 10, the damage was already done. Not just to her, but to us. Our marriage was gone. The life we had built was in ruins. I remembered once hearing a proverb, something about revenge leaving nothing but emptiness behind. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it, hadn't believed it. But sitting there in that courtroom, watching the bailiff cuff my wife and lead her away, I understood. Revenge didn't bring peace, didn't fill the void. It just left me sitting there, hollow, with nothing left but the memory of what we'd lost. As Stella was escorted out, I caught a glimpse of Emily sitting a few rows away. She hadn't said much since the trial began, but her eyes spoke volumes. She knew. Stella must have told her about the affair, must have told her that I had set her up. But Emily hadn't said a word. She kept her silence, though from the look she gave me, I knew she'd guessed everything. Maybe out of loyalty to Stella, or maybe because she didn't want to add to the damage, she kept quiet. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and then she looked away. Carl was devastated, his head down, his fists clenched on his lap. He had been the one who never stopped believing in his mother, even after everything that had happened. It hurt to see him like that, but I couldn't change his feelings. David, though, sat still and unmoving. His face was calm, not a trace of emotion. He knew the truth, and in his eyes, this was just the end of a long and painful road. He didn't need to say anything. He understood what had happened and why. We didn't say much as we left the courtroom. Stella had already been taken away, and the reality of what had just occurred settled in. Carl gave me a half-hearted nod and walked off, his shoulders slumped, clearly crushed by what had unfolded. David lingered for a moment, but neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. Some weeks passed after the sentencing, and life began to move on, albeit slowly. The house felt emptier, quieter than ever before. Stella was gone, and Carl barely visited anymore. He couldn't handle the weight of what had happened. David still checked in occasionally, though we didn't talk about the trial or what had gone down. It was a mutual understanding, a silent agreement to let it be. Then, one afternoon, I got a phone call. The name on the caller ID caught me off guard, William Hayes. The lawyer who had abandoned Stella's case, the man who had walked away without explanation. I hadn't heard from him since the trial, and I had wondered once or twice what had made him step back. "Kevin," he said after I answered. His voice was calm, polite, like we were old acquaintances. I wanted to reach out. "William," I replied, unsure of what to say. "It's been a while." "It has," he agreed. "I'm calling because I figured you might want to know why I withdrew from the case." I didn't say anything, just waited for him to continue. "A while back," William began, his tone steady, "I went through something similar. My wife, she was unfaithful. I found out, and it tore my life apart for a while. I handled it differently than you, but I understand the kind of pain you're dealing with." I was silent, processing his words. "I couldn't be part of it," he admitted. "When you told me what had happened, I realized I was too close to it. I couldn't stay on the case, knowing what I knew. It wasn't about ethics or professionalism, it was personal. I didn't want to get tangled up in someone else's situation when I was still working through my own." I could hear the weight in his voice, the pain that still lingered beneath the surface, even if he'd moved on. "I've already put it behind me," William added quickly, as though he didn't want to dwell on it. "I'm not looking to rehash old wounds. I just wanted you to know. I understand what you're going through." I nodded, though he couldn't see it. "Thanks," I said quietly. "I appreciate that." We didn't talk much more. William made it clear he didn't want to revisit his past, didn't want to chew over the details of his wife's betrayal. But for some reason, his call brought me a strange sense of comfort. It was good to know I wasn't the only one. That others had gone through this, survived it, and come out the other side. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen, staring out the window at the empty backyard. As for Stella's lover, the man who had started all of this, I had no idea where he was, or what had happened to him. I hadn't seen him since that day in front of the house, and frankly, I hoped I'd never see him again. It didn't matter. He had been a catalyst, sure, but in the end, it wasn't really about him. It was about the choices Stella made. The choices we both made. If you were to ask me if I was afraid that something would go wrong, that I'd get caught, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't. Of course, I was afraid. Afraid that somewhere along the line, one wrong step would send the whole thing crashing down on me. That somehow, I'd end up the one facing judgment instead of Stella. Every time I saw those papers, every time I heard her talk about her case, the fear crept in, just a little whisper in the back of my mind. Was I ready to answer for it? To face the consequences if things had gone the other way? Honestly, I think I was. You can't do something like this and expect to walk away untouched. I knew what I was getting into the moment I set everything in motion. Maybe there was a part of me that wanted to be caught, that wanted someone to call me out, to force me to deal with it all. Now, do I regret what I did? That's a tougher question. I think, if I had to answer, I'd say yes, more than no. Not because I feel guilty about what happened to her, but because of what it cost me. I'm not sure the price I paid was worth the satisfaction I thought I'd feel. It's funny how things turn out in the end. But I'll tell you this, what I'm most afraid of is spending the rest of my life wondering if I'll ever find an answer to that question. Whether what I did was worth it, or if it was just another mistake in a long list of them. I suppose that's something I'll carry with me for as long as I live. Maybe the answer will come someday. Or maybe it won't.